Sharon Smith is the author of many articles in Socialist Worker, the International Socialist Review, the books Women and Socialism, and Subterranean Fire, a book specifically about the history of the American labor movement. Today she's going to be speaking about, by any account, one of the high points in the American labor movement, the sit-down strikes of 1937. So, Sharon.
I would just like to explain this bottle of cough medicine before rumors begin to spread about. I may have to use this because I've been sick for a couple of weeks, so I don't want to burst out coughing and whatever. So anyway, as David said, you know, I have the pleasure today of talking about probably the high point of U.S. working class history, because if you were going to name one moment in U.S. history that marked a turning point for the class struggle, an event that transformed the political terrain in the U.S. For generations to come, that shifted the balance of class forces that for so long had been weighted so decisively in favor of capital, and then shifted so that workers began to go on the offense. You'd have to say that that moment would have to be on February 11th, 1937, when the victorious Flint sit-down strikers walked out of the General Motors plants that they had been occupying for 6 weeks, having defeated the world's largest corporation, one of the world's most vicious anti-union corporations, run by one of the most, if you will, the most detestable ruling class families, the DuPont family, who had earned a reputation for, about 100 years previous as being vicious, anti-union, ruling class so-and-sos. It has to be that moment. They marched out in victory. They brought GM down to its knees and forced General Motors to agree to finally recognize the right of workers to organize themselves into unions. It was the Flint sit-down victory over General Motors that finally really opened the floodgates of workers, and workers just began swarming into unions in 1937. Hundreds of thousands of workers took part in a sit-down strike after the Flint victory in 1937. This is what won the 8-hour workday finally, after many decades of workers trying to struggle and win that. The 40-hour work week, and introducing the whole idea of the weekend, which for you younger folks I really need to explain. There used to be this really wonderful thing known as the weekend. It took place on Saturday and Sunday, and you know, that was a day when most workers weren't required to go to work instead of the way it is today when you're running off to your second or third job. It was a brief but glorious time. Now, the Flint victory really has to be seen in its long-term significance, both before and after, to really be fully appreciated. For over 60 years, U.S. capitalists had fought tooth and nail to prevent workers from winning a single right at work, in particular the right to organize into unions. They used every means at their disposal, including armed violence, as a routine matter to break strikes and defeat unions. By 1929, the end of the so-called Roaring Twenties, which, by the way, was a fabulous era of prosperity only for the already prosperous, perhaps something we can relate to today. By the end of the 1920s, the percentage of workers who belonged to unions had dropped to lower than it is today. It was only about 5% of workers in the private sector. And just about all of them were craft workers, skilled craft workers. Now, the onset of the Great Depression, however, brought about a crisis for capitalism. And part of that crisis was that it lost all credibility to the mass of workers who were thrown into poverty, thrown into unemployment, and found that the government basically took no responsibility for their well-being. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic president who had run for president in 1932 with a campaign slogan that today, you know, he said, "I promise a New Deal for America." Well, at the time, it was an empty, meaningless slogan. He never said what that New Deal was going to be. And actually, it was only after he was elected that he began to feel some pressure to do something, to at least appear to do something for the working class. So first, in 1933, Roosevelt gave workers the right to unionize in a rather ambiguous clause inside the National Industrial Recovery Act. But the employers thumbed their noses at it. They scoffed at this idea. They refused to accept it. After all, they'd gone through the last 60 years ignoring workers' right to unionize. They were not about to grant it at that point. Now, when Roosevelt began to was running for re-election in 1935 and really needed working class votes to get re-elected, that is when the U.S. Congress finally passed legislation making it absolutely explicit that workers had the right to join unions. That was the National Labor Relations Act. It was also known as the Wagner Act. But again, most of the big U.S. corporations, including, you know, all three of the big three automakers, General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford, they had no intention of recognizing this right. U.S. Steel, all the corporations were not planning to recognize unions. And instead, some of them imposed what they called company unions, which basically the company could run and, you know, negotiate with itself for its workers' pay and salary and so forth. Or they just literally thumbed their nose at the workers and refused to recognize the union. Now, when workers went out on strike, companies just fired them and replaced them all with new hires. And that's, you know, pretty much the routine that was in place when the Flint sit-down strike occurred. And actually, when the Flint sit-down strike occurred, if you can believe this, the Wagner Act itself was being appealed in front of the Supreme Court by the same companies, you know, General Motors and so forth, the big mammoth corporations, because suddenly they decided that you know, really a union election violated the rights of their workers who didn't wish to belong to unions. And so they went in front of the Supreme Court to fight for the constitutional rights of those anti-union workers. So, you know, to put it mildly, workers were not going to win the right to unionize by waiting patiently for the Supreme Court to make its decision in the middle of 1937. They had already been waiting since 1933 when they were first told that they had won this right. Now, actually, workers had begun taking matters into their own hands in 1933. And, you know, in 1934, just to give you a sense of the scope of the struggle that workers were engaging in, 400,000 textile workers from New England all the way into the Deep South joined the United Textile Workers of America, went on strike from all up and down the East Coast in what turned out to be one of the bloodiest battles in U.S. history. State militia from New England to the Deep South, in Gastonia, North Carolina, state militia showed up and were ordered to shoot to kill unarmed pickets, and that's exactly what they did. In Woonsocket, Rhode Island, the state militia showed up and shot at them with machine guns. Now, that was one of the worst defeats of U.S. history. That took place in 1934, but also in 1934, workers began to experience some victories, and that really began to turn the tide. There were strikes in Toledo. You found tens of thousands of unemployed workers went out to support the strikers at the Toledo Autolite plant. They formed a 10-mile picket around the plant. They fought the police, and the Toledo Autolite workers won union recognition. Shortly thereafter, in Minneapolis, the Teamsters Union local, really waged a general strike in the city of Minneapolis in order to win recognition for the Teamsters Union, and they won. And then in San Francisco, the longshore workers did much the same thing. They staged a general strike that ended in victory, and the tide began to turn. Now, interestingly, there was a dynamic both in the Teamsters in Minneapolis and the longshoremen in San Francisco is that instead of relying on the union leadership from above, they elected their own strike leaders from the rank and file that ran the strike for themselves. And in all three of these places, Toledo, San Francisco, and Minneapolis, the workers that tended to be elected to those leadership positions were radicals, were avowed socialists, communists. There was A.J. Muste from the American Workers' Party was key in Toledo. You had a group of Trotskyists in Minneapolis, and communist Harry Bridges in San Francisco. These were the leaders, the elected leaders of the rank and file. And both the rank and file leadership and the radicals in the rank and file leadership were going to play a key role in the Flint sit-down strike of 1936 and 37. The names, may not sound familiar to you, but these are heroes of our history. Bud Simons, who was the shop floor leader over at the Fisher Body No. 1 plant, where most of it happened. He was a communist, but it wasn't about his party affiliation, it was about his commitment to social struggle. Wyndham Mortimer, Bob Travis, one of the geniuses of the strike. These were all in or around the Communist Party. Janora Johnson, who founded the Flint Women's Emergency Brigade that I'm going to talk about. Kermit Johnson, her husband, who led the Chevrolet No. 4 takeover, were members of the Socialist Party. These radicals, of course, didn't magically produce class struggle. Their presence alone did not produce class struggle. But the level of class anger by the mid-1930s was such that the way historian Sidney Lenz put it, he said all it took was one or two radicals at work in a particular workplace to set the whole process in motion. A couple of people with maybe a little bit of union experience who could put forward a strategy for unionizing, that was enough to get things going. Now, fair enough, but that wasn't enough to win, and that's the genius of the Flint sit-down strike. Now, of course, oftentimes we look back at, we're looking at photos from the 1930s. We see the victory, we see the workers marching out with their fists in the air and what have you. And, it's easy to remember these glorious moments of victories, and then forget how difficult it was to achieve them, because there were many obstacles in the way. It's not the case that the union movement in the 1930s was any healthier than it is today to begin with. The decade started with just one major union federation, the American Federation of Labor, which was strictly set out to organize skilled craft workers and refused to organize unskilled industrial workers. As a matter of fact, William Green, the AFL president, repeatedly referred to the unskilled workers in mass production as garbage and trash. At the beginning of the Great Depression, the United Textile Workers Union, which was an AFL union, represented just 3% of textile workers, all of them in the North. Now, this is what the textile workers from that bloody strike in 1934 were up against. And the union, the United Textile Workers Union, was brilliantly described by one labor scholar at the time. He said, "The union appeared to consist almost entirely of a suite of offices, a complement of officers, and a splendid array of filing cabinets." And that description undoubtedly fit the majority of AFL unions at the time. In 1933 and 1934, auto workers had swarmed into the AFL locals, demanded to be organized, only to find out that they were going to be shoved into so-called federated locals, where they didn't even have the right to elect their own union leaders, much less the right to conduct their own strikes. And their destinies were left to a bunch of crusty old bureaucrats who felt that the class struggle was certainly far beneath them. And actually in 1934 and again in 1935, the AFL leaders had directly intervened in strikes, GM strikes, in Cleveland and in Toledo, and prevented them from spreading their strike to other plants which could have won the strike. And William Green, the AFL president that I mentioned, he was very proud of the fact that he had sold the strike out. This is how he described it. He said, quote, "They wanted to engage in a general strike, but I stopped that. I said, you are in no position to engage in a general strike." And that was his report to the Executive Council. So by October 1936, and this, what you saw is that in 1935 there was a split from the AFL, the Committee for Industrial Organization, which set out to organize industrial workers. It was led by the president of the United Mine Workers Union, John L. Lewis, and they would formally leave the AFL in 1937 to form the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which the Auto Workers Union was part of. But even by October 1936, the number of General Motors workers in Flint, Michigan, who belonged to the United Auto Workers Union was just 150 out of tens of thousands. That was in October, just 2 months before the sit-down strike began. And actually, it was initially very difficult for the UAW organizers to get auto workers to join the union for a couple of very important reasons. One is what I just described, the history of AFL sellouts that, you know, it left many of the auto workers distrustful of union leaders and unions also as do-nothing organizations. So one of the things the UAW did from the beginning is emphasize its own commitment to rank-and-file democracy, and certainly in the early stages, it was the most democratic experience in class struggle, really at any time, prior or since that point. The second reason why workers were reluctant to join the UAW is because General Motors, like most major corporations, intentionally built their factories in small cities that would quickly become company towns that GM could basically run. Flint, Michigan was one such city, Saginaw, Michigan, Anderson, Indiana. And these cities, not only were the police in the pockets of the corporation, so was the city government. In Flint, just about everybody, including the mayor, the city manager, whatnot, were present or former managers at for the General Motors Corporation. So guess where their sympathies would lie? As soon as the sit-down started, the Flint city manager immediately started a so-called back-to-work movement, again, in which, you know, so-called loyal Flint citizens demonstrated their patriotism by demanding an end to the communist-inspired anarchy inside the plants. They demonstrated their loyalty to the city of Flint by calling on the governor to get the National Guard in there to remove the so-called outside agitators from the plant. These loyal citizens also claim to be on the side of civil liberties, championing the rights of workers who did not want to join unions. Even before the strike, when the union offered to pay for an ad in the local newspaper, the newspaper refused to print it as too confrontational. The radio station, everybody turned the UAW down. But the auto companies did not simply rely on the government and the government's police and so forth, as efficient as they were. No, the auto companies wanted to be absolutely certain of the loyalty to them. Each auto company, General Motors included, built their own elaborate private army and espionage system. The Ford Motor Company in the 1930s, it's alone possessed the world's largest private army, otherwise known as mercenaries, which numbered between 3,500 and 6,000 men. General Motors was not far behind. General Motors employed at least 14 different so-called security agencies. The Pinkerton Agency was the best known of them, in an elaborate network of spies that, you know, hung around bars, you know, neighborhood bars, followed workers home, beat them up, intimidated them, and so forth. And the degree of paranoia was so great that General Motors actually employed different agencies to spy on other agencies to make sure that they weren't double agents for the union. So it was a well-known fact that even in the sit-down themselves, that there were spies that were posing as workers that were reporting directly back to the company, and even most likely on the strike committee. And this is something that was very important for the workers to realize and to form a strategy that really outsmarted the company in a brilliant way that I can't wait to tell you in a few moments. Now, it's also worth noting that the law was not on the workers' side in the 1930s. In the state of Michigan, it was actually illegal for anyone to set up a picket line of any kind or of any size. So when General Motors accused the sit-downers of lawlessness for occupying their private property, one of the strike leaders, Wyndham Mortimer, had to point out that since it was illegal to even set up a picket line, that didn't leave the workers with much of a choice. If they had set up a picket line, which was illegal, they most certainly would have been attacked by police and bloodshed would have ensued, and that actually occupying the plant proved to be the most peaceful method of going on strike. So the union had to devise a strategy that would overcome these many obstacles, and the best way they could do that was to build solid unity on the shop floor, and that's exactly where they started. I mentioned to you Bud Simon. They set up a steward system in Fisher Body number 1 and number 2, in which the workers started staging mini sit-downs, like what they call quickie strikes. You know, the foreman tells you to speed up the line. Oh, I know, there was one incident where they only gave you like a certain number of seconds to go to the washroom, to visit the bathroom. And so one of the workers jumped over the assembly line to rush to the bathroom and rush back, and got fired by the foreman for doing that. The workers staged a quickie sit down. Next thing you know, the workers back on the job. They started winning. And that's how they started settling grievances. And they learned the value of a strong shop floor organization. And that's when you started seeing that workers began to sign union cards in larger numbers in the month of November and December 1936. The union also rented an office. I mean, some of it is just pure genius. They rented an office right across the street from Fisher Body number 1, and they put a very large red light in front of the office. Whenever there was a problem over at the plant, and they got word of it, they would start flashing the red light, and the workers inside the plant would know that they, on their lunch break, they had to run over to the stewards had to run over to the union office because there was trouble that had to be taken care of. And that's how, even at, with all those company spies, there was nothing they could do to stop this process. Now, by the end of November, really in a period of 1 month alone, 4,500 workers joined. Remember, it was 150 a month earlier. By the end of November, it's 4,500 union members, mainly at Flint, Fisher Body number 1 and number 2, and these were going to become the center of the sit-down strike. Now, the UAW wanted the strike to start in really 2 key Fisher Body plants for the very simple reason. In a huge corporation like that, the plants are all interdependent. So you have to target the plants that make the parts that other plants can't do without. So obviously the car body would be absolutely essential. So they targeted Cleveland Fisher Body and then Flint Fisher Body number 1. They didn't want it to start though until after January 2nd because the Democratic governor, Frank Murphy, was going to be inaugurated into office. But the workers just really couldn't wait that long. And the strike started spontaneously on December 30th at Cleveland Fisher Body and immediately spread to Flint Fisher Body number 1 and number 2, which wasn't really planned on, but once they went on strike, why not, So, and then the strike very quickly in the days and weeks after spread to 20 other General Motors plants around the country, effectively shutting down the General Motors Corporation, making them incapable of producing any cars. Now, the sit-down strike, of course, is an ingenious tactic. Why? Because the same companies that couldn't care less about workers' lives were extremely reluctant to cause damage to their precious machinery. And that is why no one was killed during the entire 6-week General Motors strike. Now, that isn't to say that the workers, just sat down in the plant and sang Solidarity Forever for 6 weeks and then walked out in victory. No, there were many challenges along the way, and I want to describe them to you because, again, those who say that workers aren't intelligent enough to run society should really pay attention to what happened in this strike. At first, the company did try violence, the kind of violence that wouldn't damage their machinery, but, would damage the workers. They attacked, at one point they stopped food from entering Fisher Body number 1. They turned off the heat. Here it is, it's in January, it's freezing. They tried to freeze the workers out. They tried to provoke violence. And so the strikers did set up a mass picket, and the company police went and hid. This was obviously pre-planned with the city police. The company police went and hid in the ladies' washroom, if you can believe this, and then called the police station and claimed that they had been kidnapped by the strikers. That gave the police, the city police, the pretext to attack the workers with tear gas, with vomit gas, and with guns. And there was a battle overnight that ended up being called the Battle of Bull's Run, because basically the workers ran those bulls right the hell out of there. The workers fought back. They fought back. These, I mean, literally, these were mobs of vigilantes. In Anderson, Indiana, for example, after a particularly vicious attack in which a mob of, armed, crazed, vigilantes attacked the Union Hall, beat the crap out of all the union members, women, children, whatever, in the Union Hall and ransacked it and wrecked it. If you can believe it, that same night, the Anderson police, when they reported on, the events of the evening, made an official note for that evening, quote, "Nothing to report." That's the kind of what workers were up against in a lot of these company towns. Now, unfortunately, the Flint sit-downers could not count on the solidarity from their brethren over at the AFL, if you recall, the AFL, the craft union. And the AFL actually added to the anti-UAW chorus because they resented the fact that the UAW wanted to become the sole bargaining agent for the vast majority of auto workers, even though the AFL itself had refused to organize them. Now, the UAW responded, I thought rather cleverly, by pointing out that the number of craft unionists belonging to the AFL inside General Motors could fit into a thimble, and basically ignored them. But the UAW every step of the way outsmarted management. For example, to be expected, the company went and got an injunction against the strikers, sit-downers, almost immediately. A judge named Judge Black was the individual to put forward that injunction. It turns out Judge Black owned $215,000 worth of GM stock, and the UAW merely had to publicize that fact to make that injunction unenforceable. Knowing there were stool pigeons, again, among the sit-downers, even on the strike committees, they had to work around it. They conducted the strike with military discipline. No alcohol whatsoever was allowed inside the plant. They had a daily cleanup, a daily exercise regimen. They kept the equipment spotless. There were no weapons, although, as I mentioned earlier, there were some useful devices lying around the plant when necessary. Janora Johnson, who was, I mentioned earlier, a socialist, a 23-year-old woman who was the wife of sit-downer Kermit Johnson, who ended up inside plant number 4, she formed the Flint Women's Emergency Brigade after the Battle of Bull's Run, when she basically grabbed, she just went down there and stayed the night and fought off the police and realized that women really needed to organize themselves as part of the strike support. And the Women's Emergency Brigade was also run along military lines. They could be mobilized on a moment's notice to get down to the plant when needed. They had a uniform, a red beret and a red armband. Their weapon of choice? Wooden sticks bearing an uncanny resemblance to baseball bats. On more than one occasion, the emergency brigade faced off against the police and chided. They would stand there chiding the police to come over and try to beat up a bunch of women, you cowards. Now, one of the most useful tactics the strikers in the emergency brigade used was the speaker car. It was simply a car equipped with a loudspeaker that could quickly be brought in whenever needed. Whenever there was any sign of trouble. The speaker car would show up, and a lot of times it was Roy Ruther or Victor Ruther or Janora Johnson herself would use the loudspeaker to direct the picket lines in battle. So, for example, if the police tear gassed the sit-downers inside the plant, the person in the loudspeaker of the car would say, "Smash the windows! They've tear gassed the workers on the inside. They need air! Smash the windows!" And they would go over and smash the windows so the workers inside could get air. And of course, speaking of illegal, it soon became illegal in a number of these company towns to have a car speaker due to due to quote-unquote excessive noise. Now, at no point did the workers relinquish control of their strike to the union officials. This is extremely important. At one point in mid-January, the UAW, the leaders formally agreed to evacuate the plants. But guess what? The workers in Fisher Body number 1 and Fisher Body number 2 refused to leave the plant, and the agreement was null and void. Now, probably the most ingenious move on the part of the sit-downers was when they literally used the spies and the stool pigeons to outsmart management and take Chevrolet plant number 4, which manufactured engines, a very important and crucial component of a car. They did this right under the noses of the company police. How did they do it? Very simple. Knowing that there were spies amongst them, they called a top secret meeting. Top secret. And they spread the word quietly. We're going to take Chevrolet number 9 at shift change tomorrow. They did so knowing, of course, that the company spies would go right to management and tell them that they were going to take plant number 9 the next day at shift change, and they would send all the police over to plant number 9. Meanwhile, at shift change, a smaller group of workers very quietly sat down and occupied plant number 4. And that was really the key turning point on February 1st. That was when GM finally agreed to negotiate with the union, even though the union refused to evacuate the plant. Now, there was one last thing that the workers had on their side, and that is GM's competitors, the other big 2 of the big 3, Chrysler and Ford, who refused to act in solidarity with General Motors, even though General Motors begged them to shut down their production so they could basically lock out all auto workers and force the GM workers to give in. Instead, the competition decided to increase their own sales at General Motors' expense. Now, as Karl Marx pointed out of the capitalist class, they are a band of brothers, but they are also a band of hostile brothers who are in intensive competition with each other. And they can gain, capitalists can gain only by competing with each other, and solidarity is, generally speaking, out of the question. Now, here too, the UAW was very strategic. The union made sure there was a strike going on over at a major glass company that supplied windshields to Ford and Chrysler. They made sure to settle that strike quickly so that GM and Chrysler would be able to just keep churning out vehicles while General Motors was shut down completely, to keep putting pressure on General Motors, as they had to sit there and watch the competition, watch themselves lose market share to the competition. But what was good for GM wasn't good for the workers, and what was good for the workers wasn't good for GM. And solidarity was good for the workers. If the boss's class interests forced them to compete with each other, the workers' class interests brought them together in unity. UAW workers, there was a bus drivers' strike going on in Flint at the very same time. The UAW workers supported the bus drivers' strike, and guess what the bus drivers did? They offered to transport the food to the different plant, to the sit-downers inside the plants, and provide other transportation needs for the strike. At a moment's notice, also, workers from around the Midwest would flood into Flint, Michigan, from strike veterans from Toledo and Cleveland, where Bob Travis and Wyndham Mortimer had been on strike with these workers. They would come up if they called up and said, we need you on the picket line. Akron rubber workers would come up. Why? Because the UAW had supported the rubber workers when they were on strike earlier that year. They would come up and support the Flint pickets, and they would form mass pickets around these gigantic plants that were like cities in and of themselves. Students from Ann Arbor, students played a role in the strike. They published a strike bulletin called the Punch Press, and they helped out in every way that they could. The Women's Emergency Brigades started forming in other cities, and those brigades would come to Flint and fight alongside the Flint Women's Emergency Brigade. There was a stalemate that went on for weeks between GM and the UAW, even after they took Chevrolet number 4. There were rumors of an imminent attack by the National Guard. Governor Frank Murphy, Governor New Deal Frank Murphy, put the National Guard on alert and threatened to send them in. But he was also worried that his electoral career might suffer if he called the National Guard in on a group of peaceful sit-downers. And actually, the sit-downers wrote an open letter to Governor Murphy in which they courageously said that they would stand up to the National Guard. They said, "We have decided to stay in the plant. We have no illusions about the sacrifices which this decision will entail. We fully expect that if a violent effort is made to oust us, many of us will be killed. And we take this means of making it known to our wives, to our children, to the people of the state of Michigan and the country, that if this result follows from an attack to eject us, you, Governor Murphy, are the one who must be held responsible for our deaths." Well, needless to say, Governor Murphy began to hesitate about sending in the National Guard. And even though General Motors got a second injunction towards the end of the strike, they were afraid to enforce it because they were afraid that workers would stop buying General Motors vehicles if they attacked the sit-downers. The final straw came actually when Chrysler Manufacturing announced on February 10th that they were going to give their workers a 10% wage increase. And General Motors, really for them, this was the straw that broke the camel's back, because thus far in 1937, General Motors had managed to produce just 160 cars, compared with Chrysler and Ford that were churning out hundreds of thousands of cars between them. So that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Within 24 hours, General Motors had settled the strike, agreed to recognize the union, and agreed to a 6-month contract in which the United Auto Workers effectively was the sole bargaining agent for the workers. And just for those who think that communists were following a party line directed from Moscow, should be aware that Flint #1 strike leader Bud Simons, again an avowed communist, was against vacating the plant under the terms negotiated by his comrades, because the contract didn't explicitly grant UAW sole recognition, but he ended up joining in the unanimous vote that the workers held inside, that the sit-downers held, and marched out with them. That's how democratic this strike was. So when they marched out in victory, they chanted many things, but my favorite is they chanted about GM. They're shaking down to their knees. They're shaking down to their knees. They're shaking in their BVDs. And then they did sing Solidarity Forever over and over and over again in an all-night party. And I just want to make one last point. Not only are workers quite capable of fighting back and outsmarting management, but most importantly, the working class movement, as this sit-down strike shows, has advanced not when demands are just about pay. This strike was not about pay. It was about union recognition. It was about the dignity of the right to dignified existence for every human being, to not be constantly shouted at by the foreman to speed up, to be allowed to go and take a bathroom break for long enough to actually zip up and, get back to the assembly line. And their sacrifice and victory was made on behalf of the rights and dignities of all workers. And the lessons for us today, I think, should be pretty obvious.